Hello, everyone. We'll just get started. Welcome to McNally Robinson. My name is Chris Hall. I'm one of the co-owners here. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Niniwak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're gathered here today to celebrate the launch of Lloyd Axworthy, My Life in Politics, a book that tells the unlikely story of a Canadian prairie boy raised in the social gospel tradition who went on to become a prominent force in both national and international politics. As if he hasn't contributed enough already to this community, he is now setting out to fix our train problems. Marjorie can ask him a few questions about that. Many thanks to Sutherland House for publishing this book and for arranging for this event, and to all of you for joining us here to celebrate the launch. To give you a sense of how the evening will proceed, Marjorie Anderson will be up here in just a moment to offer some words of introduction. Following that, Lloyd and Marjorie will discuss the book. Following their conversation, there will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. If you are one of those here in person, please put up your hand, and our event coordinator, John Taves, who hovers behind me, will come over to you with a microphone to ensure your questions are heard on the live stream. He'll also be back at the close of the event to review signing procedure. For now, I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's host. Marjorie Anderson's professional experiences include teaching literature and communication at the University of Manitoba, co-editing the Dropped Threads anthologies with Carol Shields, and most recently working as a freelance editor and instructor of creative writing. She feels especially pleased to be part of this launch of Lloyd Axworthy's memoir, My Life in Politics, which she describes as a captivating and heartening look at a political life based on integrity, wisdom, and an unshakable commitment to doing good in the world. Please join me in welcoming Marjorie Anderson.
Thank you, Daryl. Daryl didn't mention, but we are cousins, so I thought I had to mention that. So thank you and good evening, everyone. Introducing the author that we're honoring tonight is both a pleasure for me and it's also an easy task. It's an easy task because I think for any of us, just hearing the name Lloyd Axworthy will conjure up all sorts of impressions of this man who has been a prominent public figure in our world. I was thinking about what is it that we know of Lloyd. We don't need to read about it or be told, but it's been in the air for a long time. We'll know him as one of our local success stories. He's the boy who grew up in North End, Winnipeg, and then became Foreign Minister of Canada, and really an international force for social justice and human rights. We'll have heard often about his commitment to the well-being of others, and that's not just locally or provincially or nationally, but it's really globally in his work that he did to make the world a safer, more just place. He was instrumental in the establishment of the Landmines Treaty and the International Criminal Court, so we owe a lot to him. We certainly, as Winnipeggers, would have benefited from his work in earning both recognition and respect for Winnipeg. Every time I walk around the Forks, I give thanks to Lloyd because he was instrumental in setting that up. There was his transformation of the University of Winnipeg into a center of inner city renewal and also a place for inclusion and promotion of Aboriginal rights. And most recently, just yesterday, on the front page of the Winnipeg Free Press, we get evidence of the fact that he is still working for us and for our betterment, in that he has agreed to lead the rail lines relocation study. So bravo, Lloyd. There are just a few examples of how we, if we don't know him personally, how we Manitobans and Winnipeggers know him. And I think it would be safe to say we see him as a visionary statesman. He's a tremendous champion of our city, and his prime motivation, I think we can see in everything he does and says, is to do good works in the world. Now, this evening, in his book, My Life in Politics, Lloyd is launching, he's launching tonight. Readers will have a privileged look at the private Lloyd Axworthy, whom they may have only known publicly. We'll get a look at what went on behind the scenes in daily workings of the government, at cabinet meetings, during international affairs and negotiations. And we'll also have a bird's eye view on some of the interpersonal moments with Canadian prime ministers, such as Pierre Trudeau, Jean Chretien, and Paul Martin. And also he speaks about, or writes about, his relationship with world leaders, such as Madeleine Albright, Kofi Annan, and Fidel Castro. He even states that Fidel gave him his recipe for soup after they had lunch together. So that's the kind of bond he makes with people. What struck me in his book and his writings is that in none of these behind the scene revelations does he deal with gossip or salacious detail. That's just not. Sometimes publishers want that, but Lloyd is above that. He just doesn't do. He doesn't scorn or diminish others to enhance himself. He certainly recounts veering from the politics of others and disagreeing with them, but I think that's stated in a fair and balanced way, and also a respectful way. We get to see his loyalty to colleagues and his devotion to friends and family. And he has very generous acknowledgements of the support he has received from them, from political colleagues, from friends, from his parents, his grandparents, his brothers, a special cousin, and his immediate family. One aspect of the book that I love is that we get to see the tender aspect of Lloyd Axworthy. In reminiscing about his grandfather, who is tied in Welsh, he remarks that looking back has caused him to remember how much I loved that gentle, nurturing man. And I think that's one of my favorite sentences in the book. And then there is that remarkable, loving tribute he makes to his wife, Denise. And I think it's a benchmark for what a person might dream of receiving from a spouse, that she gets that. But then this is wonderful Denise, who deserves every word of the tribute. Most significantly, what we get from this private look at Lloyd Axworthy is that we see there is no gap in how he is personally and how he presents himself publicly. Lloyd Axworthy is the real deal, I think. He lives his principles. He is someone I think we could hold up to young people and aspiring politicians, and we could say, behold, here is a man and a politician of impressive substance. So here is the man of impressive substance, Lloyd Axworthy. Okay, Lloyd, over to you.
Well, let me just thank Marjorie for a wonderful introduction. But in this world of open transparency, it's probably important to say that it was a little more checkered, my career, than she fully described. I thought it was particularly pointed that one of my friends, after the announcement came that I was going to play with the railroads in Winnipeg, said, "There's a 9-year-old boy who could never get his train set." So you keep on living in order to be able to correct those omissions of youth. And I also want to say it's a little daunting to be up at the front of this McNally audience. Normally, in the many years of coming to McNally Robinson, you could find me over in the far east corner where the mysteries are skulking around trying to get a bargain. And to be actually invited to present my own work is really something that I never quite imagined happening this way, but I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful for those who helped make it happen, including Marjorie, who applied some of her great skills to the work I did. As she went to Denise and Stephen and Tom and Bob and their wives and friends here who many times had to, on a Friday night at Ray and Jerry's over in Martini, had to listen to my latest sort of expression of the way the world should work, and were therefore able to slowly hone down some of the more rough edges of my thought and my attitude. So I'm grateful for that. I'm also, as a way of opening, in some really real way, this book is about Winnipeg. I could never have written it if I hadn't been a citizen of what is one of the more distinct and unique places on earth. And as those of you who read the book, you'll see that one of the first sort of expressions was that I was a war child. Not a war child in the sense that living in the midst of conflict, but living at a point where my father and 4 uncles were overseas for 5 or 6 years. And as a young sort of tot with my cousin, would sit at the knees of uncles who were in the Air Force and come back and talk about the machinations, who heard the CBC, which at that time was the only news outlet that talked about what was going on in the world. And also just my literary selection was Johnny Canuck fighting the fascists in Germany and always winning. So I had a kind of perhaps the last of a generation of Canadians who had that period of growing up when your country was at war and understood. And one of the items that as I wrote about it, really came back to me was remembrance of the conversations that went on with my grandparents and with my uncles and aunts who were here, fearfully awaiting the day a telegram would arrive. And one day one did. The youngest of my uncles, whose name was Arthur, became a rear gunner in the Sterling bomber. Joined when he was 18, and my cousin Gayla and I had sort of just earlier on been playing games with him. He would carry us on his shoulders, and within 6 weeks he was downed and is now occupies a grave at the Commonwealth Commissions in France. As Canadians, we're not really used to those kinds of experience. One of the reasons for writing the book, I think, is to impart just how serious war is and just how awful it is, and how its repercussions are not just for those who are violated or terrified or killed, as awful as it is, but that there's a whole large collateral damage of the way you think and the way you respond. And I think, Marjorie, that's one of the things that I hope I can share with a generation of Canadians who are facing difficult times, facing violence and conflict, is to simply say that it brings with it serious consequences that you have to live with, and that help shape what you do. And I think that was certainly for me, and certainly when there was another side to that equation, and I won't go on much further, but my father came back from the war in the late 1945, along with 1 million other Canadians. We don't realize that our population at that time was about 8 or 9 million, about that. 1 million Canadians served in the war. And I remember him marching in the OCPR station on Main Street, but coming back to a place where he had been a soldier for 6 years, starting up a family, having a wife who had been used to earning a living, and having a bratty 6-year-old wondering, who's this guy telling him what to do all this? And finding ourselves in a small apartment in this case in the West End, on Alverstone Street, next to Daniel McIntyre Collegiate, as he slowly began to emerge. But along the way, and I think some of you might remember this, that government, the federal government, with no great master plan, it built 60,000 homes directly. And you can walk across the street here, onto any one of these streets in River Heights or St. Vital or in the North End, where what was then called peacetime, wartime housing provided the first entry for veterans and their families, of which myself and my brothers grew up. And one of the trick ponies in that particular exercise was that the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation said, once you're there and you're paying rent, we're prepared to start capitalizing that rent, giving some equity to a generation of Canadians who had been depression kids, who didn't have 5 cents to rub together. And all of a sudden, they were small capitalists. They owned something. They had a piece of property and used that as a way of slowly building into a middle-class life that sort of Tom and Trevor and Bob and I were able to enjoy over time. That was a remarkable piece, but it comes back again to my sense of how important government is, how important politics are, to make sure we get it right, that we understand that the great theories of the Hayeks and the other neoliberals who said it's the market who decides. They were never the son of a veteran who had fought the war for 6 years and had to reestablish and become sort of a contributing member to our community. So it's those lessons that I hope that this book helps share. And with that, those opening sort of remarks, I just simply want to pay tribute to the fact that those days in Winnipeg, and as they followed on through, have given me so many opportunities. And I've been lucky, I've been fortunate, I've had people. And one further comment to make is that one of the important people in those very early lives was a woman named Lois Wilson, the Reverend Lois Wilson, who she and her husband Roy were the ministers of the United Church on Arlington Avenue in Atlantic, where all the family went to worship and have faith. And they were part of that vanguard of social gospel that basically had originated United College as one of the intellectual centers. And Bill Blakey, a former colleague, now sadly passed away, has written about the importance of the social gospel to this town, and how what we did and what we learned was that your faith is expressed by what you do on earth, not just in terms of preparing for whatever afterlife you may have. And I keep thinking that as Lois passed away 2 weeks ago at the age of 97, still with a smart crack and a wise crack about the world, but with this heritage, I think, of having taken so many of us under wing and given us something to believe in, that we really could. And I have to say, as I described in the prologue to the book, talking about having to make a decision to send Canada as part of a humanitarian force in Kosovo to save lives, that I couldn't make that decision if it hadn't been for the sort of rough and tumble in the basement of the manse with Roy and Lois Wilson talking to us about how we expressed ourselves by what we were able to do, and gave a kind of a core in which decisions. In politics, you don't have a lot of time to sort of contemplate the incongruities of life. You have to make decisions based on who you are and what you are. And so my thank you to Winnipeg and to the people of this part of Winnipeg who for 27 years tolerated me as their elected member in both the legislature and the parliament, which, as I say in the book, was again one of those rare privileges. So with that, what was going to be a short introduction, which I'm almost giving away chapters 1, 2, and 3. Over to you, Marjorie.
You've talked, Lloyd, about the influence of the United Church on you. And I know that a part of your book is how much you look back on your childhood and your experiences here in Winnipeg. So other than the United Church, what are two of the most prominent influences that you had from this area in your childhood?
Well, the one thing about growing up in the North End, I learned about discrimination. And one of the things I talk about in my book is that there's a group of us guys, you know, how when you're in a team, one guy has a car that takes you up to sort of Grand Beach. And we sort of chummed around until, I remember quite shocking, we were just all kibitzing or kvetching somewhere. And one of our friends said, by the way, I've had to change my name. And we said, why? I mean, are you going to become a Hollywood star or something? No, the reality was his father, in order to get a promotion in one of the downtown businesses, had to change his name, which was a Ukrainian name, to something more Anglo-Saxon. It was a stunning revelation. As a group of 16, 17-year-olds, you just don't quite capiche. And I think the Wilkinson's book on caste could be very much applied to that situation. And I guess it always meant that I've always had a certain anger about people who judge other people based upon what their identities are as opposed to who they really are in person. And the second thing, by the way, was, again, I keep bumping into sort of interesting teachers along the way. And my history teacher at Sutherland High School was a guy named J.J. Phillips. And one day he took this somewhat rowdy class I belonged to and said, next week you are assigned to go to the Civic Auditorium, which is now our archive building, to listen to a politician. Well, you wouldn't imagine the moans and groans that went up. People said, oh my God. Anyway, he then reminded that if we didn't go, 20% of our marks were going to be deducted. It's nothing like a little academic compulsion to make you do what you. And as you might expect, it was what do you call it in academic world, an inflection point, a turning point. The politician down at the podium in the Civic Auditorium had a polka dot bow tie, a slightly roly-poly sort of character. He was not a Hollywood casting sort of scenario. But here's what happened. He just won the Nobel Peace Prize. and we're talking about Mike Pearson. And he talked about what it meant to be a Canadian. He said, we can do things in this world that other people can't do, not because we're sort of privileged or smart. It's just that we've learned over time in our country how to deal with diverse situations, to accommodate, to find answers, to look for solutions. And he talked about what it meant as a country that we held our own sense of responsibility, our obligation, if you like, to be part of that world, to put our best talents to work in terms of trying to maintain the peace and to reduce conflict and to protect people. And I came out of it, I can say this honestly, with a new understanding of what it meant, of who I was. Not only was I Canadian, I thought, hey, maybe being a politician isn't such a bad idea. You can do things there. I mean, he did talk about the grace note of being in a vocation where you can make a difference. And I can see some of my friends who are politicians or ex-politicians, and I think it's a rare moment to think that how many tens of thousands of people have showed up at the ballot box to vote for you and give you the privilege of serving that community for. And so you have to say it's serendipity that let me see, that would have been, I was 17 years old, so 37, 40, 35 some more years later, I ended up being in Mike Pearson's job as a foreign affairs minister. Now, I think there's a certain kind of, what do you call it? A certain arc of serendipity that sort of that provided. So those are the two things that Marjorie and I would talk about that period. And but it does illustrate that for each of us, there are those moments that we take something from and we understand a little bit more about ourselves. And that's the nice thing about writing a book, I'm finding, is that I think there's a saying is that you live the event, and then when you write about it, you live it again, but with a much smarter assessment of what it really meant.
That's a great segue into the next question, because I think all of us here know why you would write a book. You lived a rich, exciting life, and so it makes good material for a book. But an interest I have, and I assume other people have, is what has happened for you since the book came out? What are your takeaways from having put your life down, or that part of your life in a book? How has that affected you, or what has it caused you to think or do? What's the takeaway for you, Lloyd?
Well, the immediate takeaway is I learned that trying to arrange an airplane schedule and an event, which other people used to do for me, is about the most goddamn difficult thing possible to imagine. So, unfortunately, my wife did these, but after I had sort of triple booked somewhere and said, I said, would you look at my schedule for next Tuesday? She said, Lloyd, you can't be in Victoria, Lethbridge, and Winnipeg all at the same time. So I learned my lesson the hard way.
That's a problem with your arrangers, certainly
Yeah,
not
well,
with you, right?
So, but writing a book was also a discovery. It was an enormous opportunity. My brother Tom, who's here, reminded me that in the storage room at his place in Victoria Beach were a bunch of cardboard boxes that my cousin Gayla had cut. She was a family historian. And so he shared that. I picked them up one day and started reading them. And, this COVID period, we had lots of time, and I discovered all kinds of things about my family. I'd never probably taken the proper time or patience. I learned that I had an aunt named Ella who had died of rheumatic fever. And I'm sure other people kind of knew it, but we never talked about it as a family. But I read a little Adam in the Bangor Times Plains, I think it was called, about this 18-year-old girl who was a vivacious and smart, who sort of passed away with rheumatic fever. We didn't have antibiotics in those days. And I thought, isn't this fascinating? I'm part of a family that, you know, dealt with a hard scramble of a prairie life and paid again the price for it. The other discovery was also just that I enjoyed writing. I found that
You want to write again?
I've never been I've been shameless about being able to talk a lot, but being able to put some words down and with your guidance and the help of others who helped edit the book along the way, I was able to transfer that into what I hope somebody will find an interesting narrative about the world we live in. So that was the fun of writing a book, and of course I relish the chance to once again talk in front of a group of people like that.
This is
uncontrolled by any other.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this, Lloyd, because obviously so many of us have in our head what's happening with politics these days, what kind of relationship politicians have to one another, what kind of rhetoric we hear in the media. How would you characterize the difference between, or characterize what happened in your day and what is happening now? What would you say?
Part of my answer, Marjorie, will be that about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Joe Clark and I were on a panel. It's called the Victoria Forum. And the question he put to the two of us who were in the House of Commons at the same time, but clearly on opposite sides of the House, what's happened to the trust in politics? Where has it gone? And it's not just sort of the judgment. I just read a survey the other day that there's the Gen Zs of Canada, only 30% have any trust in their political institutions. I mean, that's difficult. That's hard. And I think it's simply because the politics have become much tougher. I mean, Terry Duguid's here, he's a member of Parliament. He just knows that the slogging that he has to go through. But what has changed, and what Joe and I sort of discussed, is that we had really quite workable relationships. And I can share with you sort of 2 examples that when I was in opposition, Joe Clark and Brian Mulroney had started taking an interest of Canada getting involved in the Americas, renewing our membership in the OAS. And of course, this is the time when the Contra Wars were going on. And so Joe said one day, we called up and he asked myself and Bill Blakey and John Bossy, who was a Conservative member from Ontario, would we be prepared to be a small trio of people as parliamentarians going to Central America and coming back with a sense of what would we recommend for Canada to do in these circumstances. So we bounced around in a turboprop plane. We met a lot of quite rude American ambassadors and quite violent sort of fascistas. But we came back saying that there was a lot of things that were not happening in terms of the supporting of the local communities, and that Canada should really begin to invest much more carefully in helping these communities in agriculture and other areas. And I won't get into the details. And Joe Clark had said, this is a good report, I'm going to implement it. Terry, would this happen today? Right. And on the other side, here's a story I tell. It tells. I take it nobody's taking notes in this thing, but
just mental notes.
There were times when I found myself in certain kinds of contests inside the cabinet. Nothing to do with me, of course. But there was always who didn't quite understand what I was trying to do, and so I would contact some of my close friends on the other side of the house, including Bill, who's just a dear friend. I said, look, here's a couple of questions you could pose to me in QP. And then I can go back to Canada and say, look, Blakey's kicking the shit out of me. You have to help me recover this way. Now I expected the same thing in return, but there was a camaraderie, and I'm not saying that it's totally gone, but I think that the idea that so much of politics now is take no prisoners, and that you take these ideological tough hard lines. I also think, and this is something I write about in the book, I think there's been a real erosion of the political party as a place, as a community where decisions are made. That it's a machine. It gets people elected. It's donations. But I remember, joining up young as a 17-year-old, 60-year-old in the Liberal Party, and finding that it was a great place. I could be invited to go to a convention in the Chateau Laurier downtown Ottawa and take on some senior cabinet minister and tell him basically in only the kind of cheekiness that a 21-year-old graduate student can mount about what I thought of their particular policy. And we argued about Medicare, we argued about foreign ownership. Walter Gordon was a great sort of spiritual advisor for Tom and I at those times along the way. Those are the things that were interesting in the party, and I have found this, that in that particular party, and I think in the other parties, they were more what I think the political science call a tent. There was room for different positions, different outlooks, left, right, center, business, and beginning basically coming into the 80s and 90s, that began to shift. I think the neoliberalism took over, where it was my way or the highway, and there was only one way of doing things. And as a result, I think we began to fragment who we were and what we were. And I think we're paying a price that the political parties don't have nearly the same kind of sort of ability to help modify democracy. We used to have in our party, my party, all kinds of constitutional rights to challenge members of parliament, leaders, and so on, and hold them accountable. That doesn't exist now. They've been pretty much sheared away. And so we're seeing now, in the time that Justin Trudeau is under attack, and MPs we can ask Terry to come up and explain what his position is, that what's missing is there's no guidelines. There's no accountable set of rules about how you do these things. And so as a result, the party has really sort of eroded. And I think that's one of the issues. I also think that we fundamentally have to change our electoral system. I mean, I went through 9 elections in the first past the post system. And I've come to the conclusion that we can't continue to elect people based on who gets 3 votes more and then wins, winner takes all. And I think we have to go back to the House of Commons proposal that came when the Justin Trudeau government came in. There was a parliamentary committee that reported and said, have a hybrid system. That in the province of Manitoba, half the seats would be past the post and the other half would be a PR system, elected according to a list. And I think that would result in a much stronger representation, for example, of Indigenous people. We have, 2 or 3 members of parliament in the prairies who are Indigenous. A friend of mine who was a kind of plays around with figures and said that if we had a hybrid system, that would be closer to 12 to 14, simply because Indigenous populations don't have big aggregate. There's no Indigenous Mississauga that can elect a sort of a slate of people. But through a PR system, you can begin to correlate those different pockets and be able to elect people. And I'm not here to kind of give you that sort of chapter. I simply say it's a time that we have to be an awful lot more careful about our democracy and think about how do we. There's so many pressures now and so much attack and so much misinformation that we have to make sure that the system is working and that everybody feels involved in the thing.
What are the chances of a change, do you think?
I don't know. I think that the best chances are, well, I shouldn't say that. I've been encouraged over the last couple of years. I've watched a lot of efforts by ordinary people. I talk about the Victoria Forum.
Mm-hmm.
So here on Vancouver Island is a place where 400 or 500 people, different walks of life, different background, come together for 4 or 5 days and talk about policies that affect them. And there are political people there, but they're not sort of in the front of the room, you know, on the podium. They're listening, and all of a sudden, you know, there's ideas kind of bubbling up. And I think that there's I was at a panel in Toronto just this last week that was organized by the Canadian International Council, and they had a prize for new young professionals who are working in the field of international conflict and diplomacy. And these 4 young, there's 2 men and 2 women, came forward with some of those fascinating ideas. And the big question was, how do you translate those ideas now into reality? And I think that's one of the great question marks. And that's what I hope, like if there's a cri de coeur in the book, it's to say, hey, let's pay attention to our democracy, but let's not take it for granted. We live in this incredible country. We've all won the demographic lottery of being Canadians. But we can't let things slide in the road. We have to really work, and I don't think we're working hard enough right now. That's my old fogey view right now.
So harder work. There's on CBC often, like there's when authors are interviewed, they are given what is called the Proust questionnaire. And it's this Proust questionnaire. Yeah, I think there are 35.
Marjorie, I never got to finish Proust.
Yeah, Marcel Proust, he did, and there are 35 questions, and they're very succinct, and the expectation is succinct answers. Well, I've got a variation on that. It's the Anderson questionnaire. There are only about 7.
Have some cards you can throw a flash up?
There are only about 7 questions, but what I like about, one of the things I like about your book is that it gives us an opportunity to get inside of your expansive mind. So I want to get inside there again on a sort of a quick basis. I'm going to say the name of leaders that you have worked with, you've encountered, you've known over your political career. And I'd like you to just on the spot say a word or 2 about how you would a word or 2, Lloyd. I know that's hard for both of us, but I think a word or 2 about how you would characterize their style of leadership. Okay. So here it goes. The first one is Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
I think one of the great prime ministers of Canada, smart, tough, and a real committed Canadian. And I think his initiative, establishing a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, was the most important sort of decision of our generation and other generations. He redefined the country for us, and I just think
good for 2 words, right? Okay, the next one is Jean Chretien.
One of the smartest politicians I've ever met. Jean Chretien could cipher a problem, a development, sort of 18 days ahead and 5 miles away. He also had to be a prime minister at a time, when I said, where there was increasing divisions and fragmentations taking place. And the one thing I have always had a great sort of deep appreciation is that when I was foreign minister, we started working on the treaty towards landmines. This was a government that also was cutting the deficit by leaps and bounds and slashes and cuts. And he called me up one day because I had been, I guess, kvetching. And he said, Lloyd, don't tell Paul Morton, but you've got $100 million to make this treaty work. And as a result, we were able to get a landmine treaty, which I think has helped the world ever since.
Okay, so generous would be one word, I think. Okay, Paul Martin.
Pardon me?
Paul Martin.
I think Paul was a very nice man. He wasn't a great politician. And I think that he didn't have the same sense of bringing people together. I think that there was he could be a great companion. I think I remember one time Denise and I had dinner with him in Montreal, and it was really an enjoyable evening. But I don't think that when it came to the some of the tough issues, that he had that kind of political nose, except this. The one thing that my friend Alan Rock has convinced me of, Alan went to become our UN ambassador. And one of the last of the foreign policy initiatives I took was to establish what was called the responsibility to protect, which was a way of saying that at the protocol of the UN is that any country that is a predator, that will not protect its people, the international community has a responsibility to do it. And Paul Martin became a very strong advocate of that, and so I pay him tribute that.
Good. More 2 words. The next one is.
Are you counting these up right now?
I understand that 2 expands into 100. I understand that. The next one is Kofi Annan. I know from your book that this was a relationship that you valued.
It was one of the great odd couple relationships. I mean, here was this sophisticated international diplomat who had worked his way up the Byzantine world of the United Nations. And you had this prairie politician who had worked his way up the greasy pole of politics. And yet we found ourselves in common ground. And he was such a not just a gentleman in the manners, but also in the way that he treated people. And at one point, it was the last one point, we were actually on the Security Council, chairing it. And Stephen, who was then about 11 years old, 12 years old, came down to New York because I was kind of camping out there around here, chairing the Security Council. And at one point, Steve, you remember this, that Kofi came by and said to Steve, would you like to meet him? He said, sure. And said, Kofi, come into my office. And so they started to chat, and Stephen told him how he was playing, I don't know, what was it, what class of hockey? And from that point on, every time I saw Kofi Annan, he said, so how's that hockey player doing? So
That says something.
he was a very fine man, and I think that he made clearly the big mistake he made was in Rwanda, but that was part of the UN system at the time. He then spent the next several years as Secretary General working to correct that, and was really probably one of the leading forces in trying to establish the UN as a place to protect ordinary people, as opposed to simply play the diplomatic roulette games. And I think that he's one of these people I just have a deep affection for.
Great. And Madeleine Albright.
Okay.
And just a few words.
Lemmy's less than 1,000. I'm going to again tell you the story is that I think this would have been in somewhere in 98, and I was on there's a Jubilee Avenue. It's closed to have one of its summer parties, and there was a beer garden. And as a kind of constituency politician, it was clearly my responsibility to be there. And as we were kibitzing, one of my assistants came over and said, this is about 10 o'clock at night. He said, Madeleine Albright's on the phone. I said, oh, do tell. So I picked the phone up, and the first word she says, Lloyd, if we weren't such good friends, the Marines would now be landing in Prince Rupert. Kind of caught my attention. The background of the story is that we've been having big conflicts over salmon out in the West Coast. And our salmon fishermen kind of got fed up and circled an American cruise ship. And there was some law that went back to 1842 that anybody who sort of tried to entrap an American vessel could be invaded. And already the Mikowska, who was the senator from Alaska, was already calling. And I said, well, Maddie, can I think about that? It's gonna. She said, no, you have to. I have to say something to the Pentagon so that before they sort of start letting the rockets fly or something. Well, she was very wily and said, we talked. So we said, why don't we throw this up to the president and the prime minister and get it out of our hands so we don't have to deal with it. Well, we did. We recommended there be an appointment of each of them of an envoy to deal with salmon. And we had Dr. Strangeway from UBC. And I forget the name of the American, he was a State Department guy, but we also had a terrific environment minister at that time, David Anderson, who had the seat from Victoria. And he had a real understanding of conservation of these things. And so they went to work at that, and we worked out finally to get the fishermen to leave the boat. And then we decided we better solve the problems so we're not sort of flirting with danger for the Americans for the next several years. And we came up with a deal that we would pay the Americans to build a series of salmon ladders. And don't ask me what the hell it does, but I just know we were paying for it. I think salmon would be able to go up somewhere that they didn't want to go. And that seemed to resolve the whole thing. And we got a really nice story in the New York Times saying, oh, diplomacy, Canadian-American diplomacy is at work. And so Madeline.
So that's what it takes.
And that's what it takes. But she and I, when we both left office, she had a bright idea of the Aspen Institute, where she was on the board, would set up a meeting of former foreign ministers who would meet once or twice a year to talk about the great issues. And it was kind of interesting because you got not only to meet your old friends, but you also had some pretty good ideas. We were called Madeline and the X-Mins. We were prepared to kind of do a vaudeville routine on the road, and sometimes it felt like that, but she was very dear to me. And
who's leading that now? Now that she's gone, who is leading that?
Hillary Clinton.
Oh.
And we have a meeting in Italy this come December, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to make it. I think I'm looking for some company in the way, but I think like Son Stevens has offered to be sort of part of my own sort of as I stumble my way through the process.
Oh,
but anyway, you know something. So often there is misinterpretations, and I think that I could, well, I won't, because I want you to buy the book and then you can read more about Madeline and I. But the reality is that she was a genuinely sort of insightful diplomat, politician. She wrote the book on fascism, which really has become the gold standard in describing what the hell's going on now, about how fascists take our democratic systems and turn it to their own advantage. And we don't have to look very far than 60 miles south of us to find out what's going on. And she had that pegged 10, 12 years ago. She understood, because she had been born in Czechoslovakia. Her father had been a Czech diplomat. She knew exactly just how little our virtues, our democracy could be corrupted and turned into something that would become pretty autocratic and authoritarian. So again, it's one of those people I had a great privilege of meeting.
That's great. I just have one more on my list, and it's not 35. But what about the ones we've talked about so far? It's what you can say, positive things, certainly you can. But I'm wondering, I know that you sat in a room with Slobodan Milosevic.
Yes.
And so how would you characterize that kind of leadership? What would you say?
I can say it in 3 words. He was evil.
You felt it, did you?
Oh,
yeah.
Deep sense. There was 2 real people that scared the hell out of me. One was Milosevic, just totally amoral, and a guy named Fodi Sanko, who was the head of the Lord's Resistance Army in Sierra Leone, who had nothing but delight in butchering young men and so on. And the guy named Victor Garbo, who was the Ghanaian foreign minister, and I were asked by the African sort of union if we would try to negotiate the release of a number of children, were children. And we ended up sitting in his bunker, with these big guys, you know, with big machine guns and all greased down. And I kept going to Victor. I said, "You think it's time we left?" And I wasn't kidding, because when we finally sort of scooted out of there, we found out that while we were talking, the militia that he commanded were attacking a group of UN peacekeepers and killed 7 or 8 of them. So this is not a guy that you really want to invite to your summer picnic.
Yeah. You must come away from having exposure to people like that. You must come away feeling like you were somewhere you didn't want to be.
Well, I think I would. I'm going to look at Jean Chretien here. I'm going to recall the words of Reinhold Niebuhr, and said, "The world is an evil, ugly place, but it's up to good people to try and make it better." Isn't that pretty close, Jim? And he wrote that great book, Children of Light and Children of Darkness. Yeah. And I think that Niebuhr described the kind of world we live in.
That's a great one. Question I have is at the end of the book, the ending of a book, I think, is often telling and instructive. And you chose to have a proposition for Canadians and your vision of what Canada needs to do to incorporate the Indigenous people in the way that it should be. Why did you choose that? And why is it important to you that it be there? Which is a major point. The end of a book is really something that stays with people. So just tell us a bit about why you chose that.
Well, I think, like most Canadians, step by step, I learned about just the transgressions that were committed in the 19th century and up until our own time, in terms of denying basic rights and treating Indigenous communities as second-class citizens. Phil Fontaine was a close friend, and he and I and Jim Carr, the late Jim Carr, would go on canoe trips. And one time we ended up in a sweat lodge together, and that was the first time that when Phil Fontaine exposed his own experience in a residential school, which is really quite horrifying. And I remember we came out, this was on Dakota teepee lands, just off the Assiniboine River, and we came out and it was about 5 o'clock in the morning. We talked, and that's when Phil really explained about just the way in which that experience was so diminishing. And from that point on, I tried to learn more about it. One of the important things in the government was when we finally sort of had the Crown sort of commission on the rights of the Aboriginal people that really set the tone. I think following governments have tried to pick up. But what was missing is that in 2015, Phil Fontaine and his partner, Kathleen Mahoney, who's a constitutional lawyer at the University of Calgary, did a presentation of the Senate of Canada and said, "It is time that Indigenous people be properly recognized as a third founding nation in Canada. It's time that we said that if we can have a civil law and a common law, we can have an Indigenous law, which has a very different set of requirements and standards and norms. But if we can sort of work out in a constitutional way the rights of French and English, but it totally ignored that we do not recognize a founding people. Their rights are still being administered by 2 departments of Indian Affairs making most of the decisions for them. And that's still true today. And so with that in mind, I thought, what can I do in this book to kind of try to express what my feeling was, where do we go next as a country? And here's what I believe, and it's not easy because I put this proposition to a lot of people, and a lot of times it's glassy-eyed or responses. is that until we establish that fundamental set of acknowledged rights and relate that in terms of how we govern, how we deal with our legal system, how we deal with our cultural issues, how we deal with our foreign policy. Until we do that, we're not a fully complete country. We're not going to live up to our potential. And it's time as a country that we know that we've got to do something different. And it's time that we, as I talked about the charter, I mean, that changed the whole debate. And that was one of the things that gave an opening to the kind of thing I'm talking about. We couldn't do it if we didn't have a charter as the base foundation. But the next step is to say we now have to convert the rights there. We included Indigenous rights in chapter 15, but we haven't really sort of fulfilled them in a full way. We negotiate, we give money, we have court cases, but the fundamental idea that they're still second-class citizens, and still, if you're on an Indian reserve, that the property you occupy can't be used as a piece of capital, like my father could use it in 1946. We're still making decisions on behalf of the Indigenous people. We have no damn business making, and we have to do it right. And I understand that's not going to be a popular thing, it's not something, but it's time we started thinking about it and considering where do we go with this thing. And I'm hoping this book might be a kind of Indigenous people themselves are working on it. There's all kinds of quite fascinating, incredible, but the rest of us aren't being quite so diligent or responsible. And that's what I really think. I hope that last proposition at least will get people talking about it. And but I can't wait until a book review comes out in the National Post to tell me what I should really do.
I've had a great time asking the questions that I wanted to ask. I have a feeling that people in the audience would like to ask questions too, so I'd like to open it up to anybody who has a question, and here he is. He'll give you a couple of words on whatever you want.
And actually, Marjorie, I would never dream of contradicting you. However, this has been such a rich and wide-ranging conversation. We've actually sailed well past our closing time. So with that in mind, what I would like to offer is some closing comments from you folks, and then there will be an opportunity to talk to Lloyd directly one-on-one at the signing table if you do have any questions.
We used it all up.
So I will defer to you folks if you have any closing comments before I review signing procedure.
Well, I think this is what you call a filibuster. And it works.
Yeah.
It works.
Well,
No, well, you
Yeah.
have some closing words, and I'll
No,
just put a period on it.
no, well, I think we have to wrap it up. Is this what John said?
Yeah.
So I want to thank Lloyd for the opportunity to ask him questions and have a conversation with him. I admired him as a politician, and since I've gotten to know him personally, I certainly have admired him as a man. And it's great being able to sit here and ask the questions that I want. So thank you. And I'm in your camp where people want 2 words and we give them more. Because I think this is good to do. So thank you, everybody, for being here.
And can I just add my own thanks to all of you for coming? And generally, the folks in this town who, for a lot of years, have given me support and ideas and thoughts. And there would never have been a life in politics if I hadn't got elected. And there's a lot of people in this room who helped me get that way. And even if they didn't, were prepared to tolerate me along the way. So it's been a great life. And I hope that you'll find in the book some ideas and thoughts. And let me go back to one of the lessons that the Indigenous community has to give us, and that is the 7th generation principle. And what that is, that every decision you make has to take into account not just your children or your grandchildren, but the 7th generations from now. How will they be impacted by what we do? If we were able to incorporate that principle into our business, into our governments, into our universities, we would be a very different place. And I'm hoping that maybe this book helps suggest ways of doing it. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
I
sir.
always go for Jonathan Lunsford. I do want to say one thing is that in chapter 7 of the book, that you will be somewhat astounded to read that I pay a tribute to Eustacia Vi, who was a character of a Thomas Hardy novel. And they said that in high school in grade 11, I read the Hardy book and said that someday I'm going to meet Eustacia Vi. I have to the
Thank you so very much, Lloyd. Thank you, Marjorie. We will now move along to the signing portion of the evening, so we will ask you just to remain in place for one moment as we need to safely transport Lloyd to the signing table before anything commences.
down these steps.
That's exactly it. So the only thing I will point out right now when it comes to the signing is that I will let you know when we are situated. Please feel free to come over to a table just beside our cash desk. There are copies of the book there. There are copies of the book at our central cash desk. And I will point out one thing to you. The strangest thing about a large book launch like this is that it does turn into a Fellini-esque carnival of people from every possible aspect of your life, where folks you have not seen blend with people that you see every day. So I will be wandering down the line to write your name on a Post-it note. This is not because we don't believe you can spell your name when you get to the table. It just ensures you can spend more time chatting when you get there and then smooths that particular conversational aspect along as well. We're so very grateful to Sutherland House for publishing this book, of course, and for making this evening a possibility. To all of you for coming here, for your kind and warm attention. To Marjorie for her inimitable hosting. Please do give her a round of applause. And of course, to Lloyd Axworthy. Have a wonderful night, everyone.